Today's lecture is going to be the Assyrians during the Seleucid Empire, the Parthian Empire, and the Sasanian Empire. It's a lot, but we're going to really here focus on the Assyrian people and the Assyrian landscape using archaeology and textual evidence. And we will touch upon the reigns of these various monarchies, understanding in general who they were, where they came from, and how they ruled, and their specific interaction with the Assyrian people. So to go back again, the Achaemenids ruled between 550 and 330 BC through their various kings that are listed there, Darius III being the last, who was slain by his own men, his own assistants, at the time of the arrival of Alexander, known as Alexander the Great. The Seleucids then were a descendant of the empire of Alexander, and these were his generals who split the empire into various parts. The Parthians then follow the Seleucids. The Parthians are similar to, one could say, the Scythians, which came from the Uzbekistan area and into the area of Iran, east of the Caspian Sea, and into the area of Iran proper, and ruled the entire Middle East for something like 400 years. They are followed in turn by another Iranian people, the Sasanians. Different, not the same, a different Iranian people. Just like Semites are different, Iranian people are also different. There are various groups, ethnic groups. The Sasanians follow in the line of what we could say as Persians. And I will make reference to how the Sasanians viewed themselves and why they did so. Were they really walking in the line of the Achaemenid kings in the ancient past, or did they kind of form their own history and have their own history? Now, first of all, the Achaemenid Empire owes a lot to the Assyrians, a great debt to the Assyrian imperial ideology. The Achaemenids really were much closer to the Assyrians than were, say, the Babylonians or the Neo-Babylonians that came afterwards, the Elamites or the Medes. The similarities reveal a distinct Assyrian influence on the Achaemenids in the way they ruled, their highway system, their administrative system, and even their art. And you could see here, this is something that was carried from this is a seal of the Assyrian king on the left, and on the right is the seal of the Achaemenid king. And you could see it is virtually identical, minus the crown and the specific dress. But certainly the slaying of the lion from the top and the bottom is the sign of the Assyrian king. And the symbol here is that the Assyrian king controls chaos in the world. Now, the Seleucids that came after the Achaemenids had ruled, their empire existed from 312 or one could say 330 BC, but there's no continuity between Alexander the Great and his generals. The empire broke up. Alexander is not really the founder of these specific empires. Ptolemaic Egypt, Antiochus ruling in Syria, and then Seleucus ruling in Iraq, from Iraq, what is today Iraq, all the way to Afghanistan. So these are separate empires. And important to know that they are not being ruled from Greece or from Macedonia. Now, Alexander, and this is a great point of contention, there's always arguments about whether Alexander was really Greek or Macedonian. Well, he was Macedonian. He was not Greek, but he was Hellenized. So he was Greekified, I guess one could say. He adopted Greek culture, was educated in the Greek system, but in terms of ethnicity, Alexander led a Macedonian force into the Middle East and conquered the Middle East using relatively small numbers of military force, in terms of a military force. So the Seleucids conquered. One of the battles that Alexander had was right next to in defeating the Achaemenid Empire, and the Assyrians participated largely on the side of the Achaemenids or on the side of the Persians. The armies were defeated. Alexander conquered this area, conquered the city of Erbil in the heart of Assyria, but eventually the power of the Seleucids moved south into Babylon. That became the imperial center. Excuse me. The imperial center of the Seleucids was Babylon. And on the western side of the Tigris was a new town that was built north of Babylon, where Baghdad, in the vicinity of Baghdad today, which is known in the Assyrian language as Salep, Salep Tisfun. We often hear, those of you familiar with the Church of the East, for example, you've heard this reference, Salep, Seleucia Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon was built by the Parthians and later taken over by the Sasanians. Seleucia was built by the Greeks, or the Macedonians, I should say, specifically by Seleucus, who was the emperor, who became an emperor. He was a general of Alexander the Great, became an emperor, and began to rule from where, again, not from the west, but the center of this empire became Babylon and his city of Seleucia. And the pictures that you see on the left are the ruins of this once great city, which was built at the time of the arrival of the Macedonians in Mesopotamia. And it was a time when Babylon was abandoned as a capital city, and a new capital was built on the Tigris. One of the features, as far as the Assyrians are concerned, of the rule of the Seleucids is that during this time, cuneiform lived on. In fact, cuneiform writing, Akkadian writing, specifically Babylonian or Assyrian writing, continued on this time, and there were various words used, for example, for Antiochus, for Seleucus, and so on, that were written in the cuneiform language. There is the famous cylinder of Borsippa that was used as a sort of a foundation tablet for a temple. The Seleucid kings were very much into supporting the priestly class that existed in Mesopotamia. The kings that came after, not just the Persians, but the Greeks, and later the Parthians, were great patrons of the various temples that existed in Mesopotamia. After all, why rile up the population when you don't need to? So one of the things they would do is befriend the priesthood and support the priesthood, and we have evidence of support for the various priestly class in various cities in Mesopotamia, specifically in the south, and I'm sure in the north these priestly classes also exist, and we're going to touch on that in the coming slides. But one of the interesting developments that occurs during this time is that the Greeks begin to understand, or the Macedonians, the gods of Mesopotamia from their own perspective. So, for example, Nabu, the Lord of Wisdom in Mesopotamia, is understood as Apollo. Marduk, in the south of Mesopotamia in Babylon, is understood as Zeus. Ishtar is understood as Aphrodite, and so on. So the Greeks understand Mesopotamian culture and fuse the religion, and we have to remember there is no such thing as the separation of church and state in these societies during these times. People understand themselves to be tied to a culture that includes faith. In other words, faith is a component, an integral component of one's culture. It is not anything different. So you don't hear anybody saying, the king and the state are separate. And so for this reason, the king who takes over, such as Seleucus and others, Antiochus, they become supportive of the priestly class, because after all, the priestly class in Mesopotamia is a gravitational force of culture and faith. A term that you should recognize as connected to the Seleucid or Seleucid kingdom is Kirkuk. The city of Kirkuk is originally known as Kerch Bet Siluk, which is Kerch means in the Old Assyrian is the house or the city of the house of Seleucus. So that's the term. And the history of Kirkuk in traditional Assyrian religious sources, for example, the Church of the East and so on, is known as having begun with King Sargon II of Assyria and proceeding all the way to the year of the Greeks, or the year of the arrival of the Seleucids, the Seleucid Empire. And one of the innovations that the Seleucids had invented was the year. And so this became something that the Assyrians adopted and used in their church calendar. So there's often a reference to the year of our Lord, Maran, and the Greek year, Shinit Yonai. So that's 300 some years prior to the arrival of Christ. So the Assyrians would often use two calendar years, the year of our Lord, which is, of course, what we know as the Common Era, and then they would also use the year of the Greeks, in the year of the Greeks. And that was typically 300 years earlier than the year of our Lord. The style of architecture in Mesopotamia during the time of the Seleucids and the Parthians begins to change, and we begin to see a fusion of what is known as classical, Roman or Greek type of building, along with ancient Assyrian type of arches and buildings that are grand, carry this format. This particular image is from Hatra, which is a city next to the city of Assur, which fused the Greek style along with the ancient Assyrian style and Parthian style. And this city is an interesting city, and it remains in one could say in scholarship, really understudied. And hopefully and thankfully, ISIS did not do much damage to it. It could be studied more in the future, and we could find out some very important historical facts about the continuity of Assyrian history and Assyrian religion. And so what about Assyrian religion during this time? Because we often think that after the fall of Assyria, really the religion of the ancient Assyrians was kind of gone. That's not the case. Absolutely not the case. And what we have from the historical and archaeological evidence is that after the fall of Assyria, the temple of Ashur was rebuilt again for the second time. And it was rebuilt again during the time of the Parthians for the third time. And so we know that Assyrians practiced their ancient religion. Of course, there was fusion of different interpretations, emphasis on this god or that god, rather than Ashur alone as sort of the head of the pantheon of Assyrian gods. Nevertheless, Assyrian ancient religion continued on, and we have evidence of this well into the Christian period. In other words, into 200 and 300 years AD. So 300 years after the arrival of the religion of Christianity, and after the arrival, purportedly, of the Assyrian saints Mar-ad-Din, Mar-Mari. Well, the Seleucid or Seleucid kingdom is gone, and the Parthians arrive into Mesopotamia. I'm not going to go into detail of the battles between the Seleucid and the Parthian Empire. I'm just going to refer to the fact that they came in and took over Mesopotamia because our focus here is the Assyrian people. One word about the origin of the Parthians. Again, they come from an area which is to the east of the Caspian Sea in present-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, this area. And they penetrate the area of Iran. These are thought to be nomadic people. They are thought to be Scythians or related to the Scythians. Their origins are in the Parni tribe. Again, these names may be confusing to us, but it's important to know that they are basically an Iranian people that come into this area. They are not Persians. They are a different type of Iranian people. And Arsaces was the founder of the Parthian Empire, or thought to be the founder, known as various historical sources, although some of these are contested, as a bandit who seized Parthia by attacking and killing its satrap. And so there's a question of whether he was really a kind of a nomadic person who comes into the area of Parthia and takes over it, or whether the Parthians the Parni were an established people, a settled people who slowly took over what was a satrap, Andragoras, under the Seleucid Empire. Be that as it may, the Parthians took over and they begin to reign in Mesopotamia. And one of their greatest kings is Mithridates I, or Mirdad. The Parthian king expands the kingdom into the empire, defeats the Seleucids, and conquers Assyria and the rest of Mesopotamia. And he is one of the first of the Parthian kings to give himself the title King of Kings, a title that the ancient Assyrians and the Achaemenids had used. So there's continuity in this Assyrian form of rulership. And by the way, the Seleucids also used strong king, great king, King of Kings, this title that the ancient Assyrian kings had used. The area that was taken over by the Parthians is a very expansive area, as you can see, and Assyria is covered in this area to the easternmost part of the empire. Now, what's important to realize here is that, again, like the Greeks or like the Seleucid Empire, the Parthians ruled from the center of the empire. So Seleucia becomes the capital, or Ctesiphon becomes the capital of the Parthians. Mesopotamia, in other words, is the heartland, but it is ruled by a people who come in from the outside. So similar to the Macedonians that come in and establish the Seleucid Empire, similar to the Parthians that come in and establish the Parthian Empire, and then later the Sasanians come in and establish their empire. Its heartland is also Mesopotamia, and later the Arabs are going to come in and they are going to rule from Mesopotamia. All of these powers have one thing in common. They come from the outside and their center becomes Mesopotamia. And in this case, specifically southern Mesopotamia rather than the north, which is significant to understand Assyrian history. Why is that significant? As we are told by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, Patricia Crone, I believe, was a great scholar who passed away some years ago. She tells us, along with Michael Cook, tells us that Assyria, which had neither the fabled wealth nor the strategic importance of Babylon — remember, these kingdoms are all ruling from Babylon and Mesopotamia — had been left virtually alone by the Achaemenids and Seleucids. Now, whether it was left completely alone by the Achaemenids is not 100% sure, but there is certainly lack of archaeological evidence as to the existence of Achaemenids in Assyria proper, meaning in Nineveh, in Arbil, in Ashur, and so on. Condemned to oblivion by the outside world, it could recollect its own glorious past in a certain tranquility. Consequently, when the region came back into the focus of history under the Parthians, it was with an Assyrian, not a Persian, let alone Greek, self-identification. The temple of Ashur was restored, the city was rebuilt, and an Assyrian successor state returned in the shape of the client kingdom of Adiaban, or in the Assyrian language, Hadia. So again, very important to see the continuity. The existence of the Assyrians does not end, as certain scholars are very loud in saying, well, there's no proof between the continuity of the ancient Assyrians and the Assyrians that come during the time of Christianity. There is no continuity between those ancient people and the classical period, and certainly between the ancient people and the modern. But again, we're seeing archaeological material here. We have the references, as Patricia Crone says, an Assyrian successor state that returned in the shape of the client kingdom of Adiaban. Client of whom? The client kingdom of the Parthians. And you see its map here. Now, one of the interesting things about Hadia and Adiaban is the fact that one of its queens, Helene of Hadia, became Jewish, converted to Judaism. The Judaism that was known at that time was different than the Judaism that we know today. In other words, there was more missionary activity among the Judean movement, or not Judean movement, but the Jewish religion at that time. It was certainly different. And so one of the Assyrian queens, along with her sons, converts to Judaism. And one could say, although we still need the textual and archaeological evidence for this, but one could say that the Jews of Iraq that left to go to Israel can trace their origins to these Assyrians who converted to Judaism during this time. Uncertain we are at this time, we're uncertain as to how many Assyrians actually converted to Judaism, but we do know that the Jews who lived among the Assyrians spoke not the Kurdish language, oftentimes they're referred to as Kurdish Jews, but they actually spoke Aramaic or spoke the Assyrian language. Their Assyrian or Aramaic was no different than the Assyrians who lived, minus, of course, with the exception of dialect differences, depending on where one lived. But Jews lived among Assyrians and had always referred to Assyrians as Surai. And Surai became, as we know, synonymous with Christian. So it's impossible to tell how many Assyrians of Adiaban had followed the example of their king or their queen and had become Jews. Josephus refers to Adiabinoi as Jews. Both Queen Helene and Izates showered presents, upon Jerusalem, and the queen took the king's sons there to be educated. The remains, after she dies, the remains of Queen Helene and Izates were sent by Monobaz II to Jerusalem for burial. And what I showed you, the image here is of a sarcophagus which was found in Jerusalem and is currently in a museum in Jerusalem today. There were a number of Adiaban Jews in Jerusalem who probably belonged to the princely household. In other words, they were converts into Judaism. They were not originally Jews. There are mentions of a Achaemenid and a Monobaz as aiding bravely in the defense of Jerusalem against the Romans, and, quote, the sons and brethren of Izates the king were bound and led to Rome in order to make them hostages for their country's fidelity to the Romans. This is according to Josephus. During this time, we find that there are many there's continuity between the material culture with the ancient Assyrians, but also there's refinement and there's change and there's innovation. So we see Greek forms of art, we see Parthian forms of art in the city of Nineveh. In other words, Nineveh is back again. It has a population. Of course, there are parts which are ruined from damages, but these are slowly covered over, and the city comes back to life again. over the centuries, and the Assyrians are living there. The native people are living there and producing various cultural items such as you see here. The sites identified, this is the city of Nineveh's, according to its walls. Now, Nineveh, of course, is very important to know that Mosul is on the east side of the Tigris and Nineveh is on the west side of the Tigris River. However, what has happened over the years is that the city of Mosul has grown large and has expanded not only around the city of Nineveh, as you see here, but also inside of the city of Nineveh, to the great detriment of many of the archaeological sites that exist there. But what we see here is that during Parthian times, there were many new buildings. The green dots show identified Parthian sites, and these were built. When I say Parthian sites, what I'm really talking about are Assyrian sites during the Parthian era, during the Parthian time, which shows Nineveh being rebuilt again. There are new buildings in this area, and these are not small buildings. These are identifiable buildings that have strong foundations. So during Parthian times, the city of Nineveh is being rebuilt again. The city of Assur, a very important religious center for the Assyrians, is now being revived again. Now remember, we are over 500 years after the fall of the Assyrian Empire. So it's very important to really sense that the Assyrians have not only not disappeared, but they are in actual fact thriving as a population, as a people, as a culture, and as a faith. Assur acquired an importance in the centuries of the pre-Christian era and in the early part of the new millennium. In 141 BC, Mithridates conquered large parts of Mesopotamia, including probably Assyria, although the Parthians were soon driven back out of Mesopotamia. In 130 to 29 BC, Assur finally fell under the Parthian influence from the reign of Mithridates II onward. That is to say, from about 113 BC, when Adiabene became a Parthian vassal state, as we mentioned before, with several other kingdoms. Assyrian religious continuity in Assur. After the city of Assur had regained wealth and prominence as a trading center in the kingdom of Hatra, which is right next to the city of Assur, in the 1st century AD, the shrine of the god Assur, whose name was now pronounced Assur, was rebuilt on a monumental scale. The new sanctuary was designed in the contemporary Iranian architectural style, taking in Assyrian style, of course, in addition, as an Iwan building, emphasizing Hatra's close political and cultural connections with the Parthian Empire. Now, when we see today some people visit the city of Assur, remember, these arches are not from the original ancient, very ancient city. They are from this time, the Parthian time. And many people confuse these arches with the very ancient Assyrian strata. Of course, the style is similar, but this particular arch that you see, and oftentimes you'll see it when you search for the city of Assur on Google, comes from the Parthian era. There was a considerable degree of continuity in the way the cult of Assur, or the religion of Assur, was practiced hundreds of years after the imperial sanctuary of Assur had been destroyed and looted in 614 BC. Very important to note that Assyrian continuity, or the religious continuity of the ancient Assyrian faith, now is in the Christian period. And W.W. Tarn, who tells us, whose focus is the Roman Empire, tells us that during Parthian times, and remember, the Romans and Parthians came into contact with each other, and again, at times Assyria was caught in between. Assyria and Armenia, in particular, were caught in between East and West, fighting for hegemony. During Parthian times, Aramaic inscriptions found in Assur largely of the Christian era, show a body of people, among them perhaps a family of temple priests, still carrying on the worship of Ashur at the accustomed spot. They worship no other god. Their names are purely Assyrian, and Greece and Iran have left them untouched. In the 3rd century AD, there appears among them the name Sarhaddon, which is an unusual name for a person who's not a king, of course. There are 3 phases in the city of Ashur that should concern us during this time. The first is around AD 117, the early Parthian period. And one of the most prominent people who had dug up this city was a German archaeologist, Andre. He is the one who has done most work, and I'm very happy to see that there is some continuity of work in the city of Ashur right now, and we really look forward to see what can be dug up, what can be found out, not just in the ancient stages of the city, but the stages that came later. By the way, Ashur is also called Labana in certain sources, which is derived from Libali, heart of the city, Libba, from the word Libba. Then there's the second phase of the city of Ashur, which is known as the High Parthian period, which extended up to AD 200 and did not produce any buildings of note. The buildings came earlier. Then the third phase, the Late Parthian period, came to an end in AD 256, according to Andre. This was the year in which Hatra was destroyed by the Sasanians. Perhaps the fall of Ashur can be dated even earlier. The last memorial inscription goes back to 227 to 228 AD. So the city was destroyed, and the temple was possibly destroyed because of the conflicts between the Sasanians and the Romans. Certainly Hatra became a victim of this clash of hegemonic powers, the Romans on the one hand and the Parthians on the other. Now, one of the examples we have of Assyrian continuity during the time of the Parthians is this particular funerary sculpture from Ra'uth Ashur, Ra'uth meaning the joy in the ancient Assyrian. And you see this figure who is an Assyrian local king or local ruler under the Parthians, with the symbols of Ishtar and Sin becoming a very prominent Assyrian god during this time. And you see the style of the stele. The style of the stele is very much in the style of the ancient Assyrian kings. We're talking about a period of about 1,000 years here difference, 800 BC to the 2nd century AD, and we still have continuity of the existence of the ancient Assyrian customs. We also have continuity in terms of language. So the Assyrian language, as many of you know, as we discussed in the previous lectures, but just to go back over this point because it's very important, the Assyrian language, the Assyrians used 2 languages, 2 scripts, one could say. Now, the exact vocabulary in both, was it the same? No, it was not the same. But the Assyrians used both languages to run their empire. And eventually, the language that was easiest to write was the Aramaic language, which is known as the Assyrian script throughout the entire Near East. And up until this day, what you see as Hebrew writing is called Kitab Ashuri, which is that the reason that is because the Assyrians used this type of writing, and the Jews who adopted it refer to it to this day as the Assyrian script for a reason. It was developed by the Assyrians. By the way, the Jews were not the only ones. The Greeks, the Egyptians, and others also referred to this as the writing of the Assyrians. So we have found, according to Klaus Baer in 1998, around 600 inscriptions that have been found from the upper Tigris area, from Tur-ad-Din, all the way to the city of Ashur. This particular language style and this particular writing style spanning from the area of Tur-ad-Din all the way to the city of Ashur. So what we have here is cultural and linguistic continuity between certain areas where Assyrians are living. Tur ad-Din, which is going to become a Christian area, which is going to become a Church of the East area initially, all the way to the city of Ashur and Nineveh. These inscriptions have similarities. They are similar in style, meaning they are the type of Aramaic that later becomes the language modern Assyrians speak. In terms of archaeological evidence during this time, Parthian occupation of this area has been recorded on 146 sites. There is still work being done in the area of Nineveh, where various other sites during this time, again, when we say Parthian occupation, it does not literally mean that the Parthians were occupying every one of these sites. It means during the time of the Parthians. This shows an increase of 75% from the Hellenistic period, from the time of the Seleucids. So there is greater development during the time of the Parthians of these areas. Increase of 134 from the preceding Hellenistic period, but also 33% greater than settlement of the Neo-Assyrian period when Oedipal Plain was the core of an empire. So there's growth of population. There may have been other populations that came in as well, but there's this growth of the population in this area. So this tells us that the Assyrian heartland was thriving with humanity. Earlier explanations of the site also unearthed the remains of a Parthian period necropolis. Major Parthian sites are evenly distributed in the region. Hellenistic sites, various sites expanded in the Persian period to cover 48 hectares, even larger, various centers here than the Neo-Assyrian, 6 times larger than its Neo-Assyrian villages. So what we see here is the growth, urban growth, and village growth and town growth in various parts of in the heartland of Assyria. The Hellenistic and Parthian period occupations of Oedipal Plain show a trend of recovery and re-urbanization after the fall of Assyria. In the succession of large territorial empires in North Mesopotamia, a landscape reboot, quote unquote, started at the end of the first millennium BC and continued with variable characteristics until the Sasanian period. So contrary to what people have thought, certain scholars, that the Assyrian heartland began to go into a demise, a slow death. Contrary to that, archaeological evidence shows that actually the Assyrians were growing as a people, as a culture, as an entity. The trajectory differs from that of the contemporary Syrian-Iraqi Jazeera, where the political and military confrontations between Rome and Parthia may have discouraged such dense landscapes of settlements. So in other words, in certain areas where the Parthians and the Romans were engaged in fighting, engaged in war or in battle, the populations were less because obviously people do not want to live in a war zone. So the Assyrian heartland seemed to have enjoyed some peace so that the Assyrians remained in this area. Dr. Lucinda Durbin tells us that clearly these traditions, meaning the traditions of the ancient Assyrians, traditions of the worship of the ancient gods, did not need a temple or religious center to survive, although we cannot exclude the possibility that the founders of the new temple made use of ancient documents to reconstruct the cult. It is more likely that the traditions were part of a lived religion. If we accept that religious traditions can survive outside the traditional temples, there's absolutely no need to take the remnants of Mesopotamian religion outside the traditional temples as proof that these temples still existed. Now, we know that the Temple of Ashur existed long after its destruction and it was rebuilt. And we need to understand the fusion of the ancient religion, the ancient Assyrian religion and religions into Christianity, and that we will in a later class. The Parthian period comes to an end and the Sasanians take over. And the Sasanians do not have anything nice to say about the Parthians. In one particular letter of Tansar, 400 years had passed in which the world was filled with wild and savage beasts and devils in human form, meaning the Parthians, without religion or decency, learning or wisdom or shame. They were a people who brought nothing but desolation and corruption to the world. Cities became deserts and buildings were razed. Now, this is one view of the Parthians. Obviously, the archaeological evidence does not bear that, but you have to see that to understand that this particular priest of the Zoroastrian religion felt that the Parthians were less than civilized. The Sasanian Empire reigned supreme in all of Mesopotamia and extends its borders all the way to India. And of course, it clashes this time with the Eastern Roman Empire, not the Western Roman Empire. And there are various clashes, and the borders of the Sasanian Empire go back and forth. Assyria still exists. Assyria is referred to as Asuristan during this time, or as Assur Shahar, just as Iran Shahar is referred to as the Empire of Iran. So the rulers of the Sasanian rulers constantly refer to the existence of Assyria and Armenia specifically as being areas of contention between themselves and the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. Sasanian monarchy was united with the Zoroastrian religion. Again, there was no such thing as separation of church and state. As in the letter of Tansar, again, we are told that for church and state, meaning the religious institution, were born of one womb, joined together, never to be sundered. So faith and the kingdom are together. They are not to be separated according to the thoughts of this particular Zoroastrian priest and according to the Sasanian rulers. And this is going to, of course, have an impact on the existence of the Assyrian Christians in this empire. What is the Zoroastrian religion? Just so you have a little bit of a background. The theology of it shows influence of Mesopotamian religion, tradition in chronological schemes of cosmic history, so similar to Mesopotamia. Fire and water are sacred, also in Mesopotamian religion and Assyrian religion. Universe is a battleground for good and evil. Ahura Mazda, or Urmazd, is good, and Achaemenid is a force of evil. The prophet Zarathustra, lived in the 7th century BC, or maybe even earlier, and brought strong moral content to religious belief, taught that people should think, speak, and do good, and the former rites of purification. So very similar to previous religions, nothing extremely unusual about Zoroastrianism, but it becomes very predominant during this time. Now, some Assyrians convert to the Zoroastrian religion. Assyria was at the crossroads of East and West, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and native Mesopotamian religion. Some Assyrians remained true to their faith. Some converted to Zoroastrianism, in particular, people of the upper classes, people who ruled, people who were, say, vassal kings or governors, converted to Zoroastrianism. Why? Well, it was the key to power and wealth, and so some Assyrians did convert. And we have references to various literary accounts from the Church of the East and other Christian sources that discuss Assyrian rulers being members of the Zoroastrian religion, those who worship fire and adorn water. They are referred to as worshippers of fire and adorners of water. Some Assyrians, as we noted earlier, converted to Judaism, but most to Christianity, mostly to the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church. As we are told by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, quote, after a detour via Judaism, the Assyrians adopted Christianity and found their heresy in Nestorianism. found their own heresy in Nestorianism as a way. It's a play with words here. But what Michael Cook and Patricia Crone are saying is that the Assyrians became a particular type of Christian, largely in the Church of the East, but also in the Syriac Orthodox Church, I would argue. Those are the early churches. Many of the ancient symbols of the Assyrian faith persist in Mesopotamia, as you can see here in the symbol of Ishtar, for example, and the symbol of Sin, and even into the time of Christianity, even into Islam. The crescent is a sacred symbol in Mesopotamia that's become the symbol of the Islamic faith. It's important to remember how Assyrians organized themselves, because if they were living as individuals, simply practicing their culture, each village separately, each individual separately, they would not be united in this type of institution that has become the church. So what was missing in Assyria? The central military power of Assyria was missing. The economic planning that came from the center was missing. Legislative power for laws was missing. Independent decision-making was made somewhere else. So the Assyrians needed an institution to tie them together. What was that institution? There were no political parties at this time. There were no secular organizations at this time. It was the church. The ancient Mesopotamian religion, again, was alive during the time of Christianity and oftentimes clashed with the Christian faith. In the book of talking about Haran, the city of Sin, in Edessa, where Mu'athrim famously was known as one of the greatest Syriac writers, he preached and wrote against the ways of his ancestors. Why? Because he had become a Christian. He had found his faith. Unlike Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, it seems that the ancient religion of the Assyrians was not as organized during this time. In other words, it was fragmented into different cults and worship practices. And so slowly, when you are disorganized, you lose power and you lose cohesion and you lose your existence. And that's what seems to have happened to the ancient religion. Assyria became a powerful network of Christian enclaves by 300 AD. So by the time of the Sasanians, the Assyrian Church, or the Church of Assyria, or the Church of the East, establishes its presence. It's the sole church in Assyria, the sole church in Mesopotamia. Eventually, two churches are formed. One is what is called a chauvinistic assertion of the Assyrian identity in the area of Assyria, and another, a more cosmopolitan church that is based in Ctesiphon, in southern area of Mesopotamia, or central Mesopotamia, near Baghdad. This is just a reference to some of the ravings against the practices of the ancient Assyrians by one particular Assyrian aesthetic. He tells us that they came around again the time of the festival, at which the pagan myths used to be recited. He's talking really about Chag Nisan, or the Akitu festival, and he condemns it, of course, as a celebration that brings locusts into the land. In other words, we are cursed when we practice this religion. So what this tells us is around 500 AD, there is still the Assyrian practice of these religions, but they are eventually fading. They are eventually disappearing or being absorbed by the churches that the Assyrians belong to, namely the Church of the East. The Assyrians establish various monasteries all over, hundreds and thousands of monasteries throughout the Middle East, of course, and specifically in Assyria. Marbehnam is one such monastery, which refers to the saint Marbehnam being linked to the Assyrian king Sennacherib, mythologically, of course. It's an apocryphal writing. And these monasteries belonged to the Church of the East and later became part of the Syriac Orthodox Church, as the Syriac Orthodox Church made its way from the area of Syria into Mesopotamia. Now, the Assyrians had during this time a strong tradition of erudition, of learning, of intellectual pursuits, and established the school of Nisibin in around 350 AD, one of the very first universities in the world. Important teachers in this school were Marnerse, known as Harp of the Spirit, because of the beautiful poetry that he wrote, and Mar Ephraim, also Mar Ephraim the Great. The school of Nisibin became so well known in the West that Pope Agapitos and other popes attempted to establish one in Italy like it. So one of the subjects taught in the school was medicine, another was philosophy and theology. And the school eventually fell apart when there were disputes about Christological divisions within the faith that was being taught. The language being taught was Surat or Syriac. And this was a very prominent school, following in the tradition, ancient tradition of learning and collecting books that Ashurbanipal had established and long before that. So there's a long continuous tradition of reverence for learning and teaching. And of course, one of the greatest of the teachers of the language, or one of the greatest saints, I should say, in Assyrian literature or in Syriac literature is Mar Ephraim the Great. He tells us, Lord, give learning to he who desires learning, and to the teacher who teaches well, make great in your kingdom. I love these lines. Alaha how yulpana, aini dracham yulpana, wal rabbit malab shafir, wida rabbat malkuta. Give learning to he who desires learning, and to the teacher who teaches well, make great in your kingdom. What could be a greater compliment to a teacher than that? Marnarse is known as Harp of the Spirit, and he was one of the greatest teachers of the Church of the East. I won't go into his poetry. I'm going to send you this slide presentation. But he praised Christ, and he taught his people about the nature of Christ and explained his Christology, or the Christology of the Church of the East, through the use of beautiful poetry. That's why he was called Harp of the Spirit. It's because of his beautiful poetry. So here I'll just read one line from one of his poems. He remained, he's talking about Christ, that being both God and man, because this is a big thing in the Church of the East. The Treknume, Trekiane, two essences, and two Qnume, or two essences and two persons, not persons, but two natures and two essences of Christ is a very important point in Assyrian Christianity or in Church of the East. He remained in the tomb 3 days as man, and the watchers glorified him with their praises as God. He said that he had received all authority as man, and he promised to be with us forever as God. So the dual nature of Christ, containing the two essences and the two natures, is, again, a very important part of the Church of the East's Christology, and Manasseh here is one of its greatest poets, as he explains it. During the time of the Sasanians, we must revisit the slaughter that took place specifically of Shimon Bar Sabai, and I want to tell you about this from two perspectives. One, from the perspective of martyr literature, Sehde, of the Church of the East, wherein the praise goes to the person who is a faithful person, believing in Christ and God, who, as a result of that, faces torture and death and that is praised. The crown of martyrdom is taken by that person, and it is a praiseworthy thing in the history of the Church of the East. So there is this literature. Oftentimes it is thought that this is, in fact, the Church of the East is a church of martyrs because it has suffered so many martyrs. And specifically, Marshamun Barsabai was one of these martyrs. He was a patriarch of the church, and he refused to pay taxes, refused to collect taxes from his people to pay to Shapur, the king of the Sasanian Empire, because at that time Shapur was engaged in a protracted war with the Romans, or the Eastern Romans, with the Byzantines, and demanded that the patriarch become in effect, a tax collector for him. And when he refused, he was martyred. And there is a long literature in the Church of the East about the martyrdom of Marshamun Barsabai. To this day, he is commemorated. It is thought that over 16,000 martyrs of the Church of the East were slaughtered during this time in the 5th century. Some historians have estimated the Assyrian Christians to be somewhere around 200,000 martyred. Anyway, there was widespread destruction during this time. Now, one of the writers who takes a different view about martyrdom of the Church of the East is Richard Payne, who teaches at the University of Chicago the history of the Sasanians, and he takes the view that the Sasanians were really not engaged in causing martyrdom to the Church of the East or to the Christians as a whole. Their point was to rule an empire where Christians knew their place and knew that because the Sasanians were engaged in a battle, and because the Sasanians had their official religion as Zoroastrianism, the Christians had to know their place and not engage in a conflict, and everything would be okay. I'm paraphrasing Richard Payne's argument. And some people found Richard Payne's argument rather offensive because there clearly was martyrdom. Now, of course, not the entire history of the Church of the East during the Sasanian reigns is martyrdom, but it is certainly a history of exploitation, of alienation at times, of dominance. It's also a history of perseverance on the part of the Assyrians and their institutions to survive, to keep their language, to keep their culture until the arrival of Islam. So the Assyrians succeeded, but it wasn't just because things were made easy for them by the Sasanians. In fact, many times it was very, very difficult dealing with the Sasanian state and the Zoroastrian religion. Of course, today the Zoroastrian religion has been marginalized and is virtually non-existent in Iran, but at that time, the Zoroastrian religion was a very prominent religion, prominent part of the Sasanian Empire. Now, the Assyrians were caught, as we were saying, between the Romans and or Eastern Romans and the Byzantine Empire. And for this reason, they suffered. And we are going to be seeing this recurring scenario over and over again, where the Assyrians are caught between the forces of the East and the West. And I would say, including up until this very day. The power dynamics between Assyrians and the Sasanians. Sasanians held political power. The Assyrians held religious power. Focus was on justifying lack of political power through religious convictions and organization. So martyrdom became something that did not represent a defeat, but rather a victory of sorts, a spiritual victory, if you will. In 410 AD, for the first time, the Church of the East becomes an official cosmopolitan church, and it's with the assistance of the Sasanian Empire, which establishes the center of the Church of the East in Mesopotamia, in Seleuc-Tisfun. Remember Seleucia, Seleuc-Tisfun, which was built by the Greeks? Well, the Church of the East establishes there, and King Yazdegerd I organizes the Church of the East in specifically the Council of Mar Ishaq in 4 410 AD as the official church of the empire. Now, there's going to be friction, of course, with the Zoroastrian religion, but there is coexistence as well. The last years of the Sasanian Empire also show much deterioration among the Assyrian institutions. The Church of the East was undergoing turmoil as internal conflicts, which we will touch on, raged within the church hierarchy. The Sasanian king Khosrow II forbade the election of a new patriarch of the Church of the East after the death of Patriarch Margiwergis I. Thus, the seat remained vacant until the death of Khosrow II in 628, as the Church of the East became rife with internal quarrels and disagreements among ecclesiastics regarding central authority of the patriarch, which was based in Seleucid. The competing Syriac Orthodox hierarchy, which refused to accept the authority of the Patriarch of the Church of the East, began to grow into Mesopotamia from the area of Syria. During this period, the Syriac Orthodox Church organizes itself within the Sasanian territory. Its territory now becomes Syria under Byzantium and Mesopotamia under the Sasanians. And a Mafriono, not a patriarch, but a Mafriono, which is just below the patriarch, begins to govern Mesopotamia and refuses to accept the hierarchy of the Church of the East. The Syriac Orthodox Church began with the consecration of Marmarutha, who was a member of the Church of the East, by the way, in Tikrit, that's Saddam's town, as the head of the Syriac Orthodox Church in Sasanian territory. I'll just tell you one anecdote from history. When Mar-Ishe Shuman had gone to Iraq, visiting back from when he was exiled in 1932, he was back in Iraq in 1970. He was shown by people in the village or in the town of Tikrit, that's Saddam's town, that we have this church and we have these books and so on. And he looked at them and he figured, well, these are not our church's books. In other words, they belong to the Syriac Orthodox Church. We are going to take up the issue of division within the Church of the East and between the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church specifically next time. And we will also talk about the formation of the Chaldean Church and other churches.